How does a ragtag volunteer army in need of a shower somehow defeat a global superpower? How did we emerge victorious from the quagmire, leave the battlefield waving Betsy Ross's flag higher? Yo, turns out they had a secret weapon a country us Brits despised was unafraid to step in. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called it, hold on, I call foul play. We had our hands full fighting a war in Europe, and it was getting too expensive to keep sending. Don't be a sore loser, Britain. This is the story of how the small underdog colony defeated the world's greatest empire, paving the way for freedom everywhere. Oh, here they go again. So, American independence. Well, it was independence for a certain type of American and not others. And it was not independence for the first Americans. Most native tribes, but not all tribes, sided with the British. Congress also knew that Native Americans had many grievances against the colonies, as the colonists were the ones pushing them off their land. Both sides actually enlisted the help of Native American tribes throughout the war, sometimes even pitting those tribes against each other. In the summer of 1770, after a few raids on the colonists by the Iroquois tribe, Washington organized an expedition that burned down more than 40 native villages. Think about that next time you rank Washington as one of your favorite U.S. presidents. And the man was a huge slaveholder, too. Speaking of, we shouldn't let the African Americans go unmentioned. Both free and enslaved Africans fought in the war and joined both sides, hoping the side they picked would help them gain their freedom. But afterwards, many were simply returned to slavery, particularly those who had fought for the Americans. Halfway through the war, the British promised freedom to any slave who joined them. In general, the African slaves stood a better chance of gaining freedom if they fought for the British. However, even those that left with the British after the war suffered mistreatment and discrimination outside of America. The Battle of Saratoga was the first major American victory, where General Gates and Benedict Arnold defeated the British. 600 British casualties to 150 Americans. This was a turning point, and France and Spain now wanted to help by giving money and supplies to the colonists. The French entry into the war made up for the Continental's lack in resources. The French began with naval skirmishes in the English Channel, and they sent a large fleet to America. But the Americans were hoping for a bigger commitment from the French. So John Adams went to France to help Benjamin Franklin continue negotiations. And Adams was disappointed, to say the least, to find out that Franklin was spending his days flirting with the local French ladies. But the Americans would get some extra help from the Dutch, who provided aid, although they never formed an official alliance. The Spanish also officially joined the colonists in June 1779. They would provide support in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast. These campaigns heavily hurt the Native American tribes in those areas. In 1780, Parliament was furious that the war still wasn't over, and the war seemed to be at a stalemate. So the British decided to make a major shift in strategy to the south, an economically rich area with a higher level support for the British, or so they thought. The British were quickly making progress through the Carolinas, and in the backcountry, British soldiers were hunting down rebels ruthlessly. The brutality inspired militias to form and rise up against the British. Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox, was a military officer who served in the American Continental Army. He used guerrilla warfare to ambush the Redcoats. Nathanael Greene knew the British outnumbered his own forces and wouldn't be defeated by conventional tactics. He split his army and had the British follow them, splitting their army into two. The British army was much slower than Greene's quick and mobile troops. Greene led General Cornwallis further and further from his supply line. The army crossed into Virginia, where more Continental soldiers were waiting, and together they faced the now exhausted British. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the two sides engaged in vicious close combat, where Cornwallis lost a quarter of his men in the fighting. At this time, the British were running out of money, while the Americans were again facing mutinies, as the men went without pay, bad living conditions, and little food. In the summer of 1781, British General Cornwallis set up his headquarters in Yorktown, Virginia. Yorktown was on the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis liked this location so that he could easily supply his troops from the sea. But the location was not easily to defend, especially if your enemy controlled the seas. But the colonists didn't have a big navy. But the French did! The French Navy took control of the bay. They combined land and naval forces, then laid siege to Cornwallis's army in Yorktown. The British were surrounded. Cornwallis held out for nearly a month before he had no choice but to surrender. By mid-October, the British were running out of food and ammunition. So on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. Both the British and the Americans negotiated a peace treaty called the Treaty of Paris. John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were there to represent America. It was decided the British would accept the United States as an independent country, and all British troops were to leave all the land that was now the United States. In return, the Americans agreed to pay off any debt they still owed to Britain and gave fair treatment to any colonists who wanted to remain loyal to the crown. The Spanish got Florida, and the French got an economic crisis that isn't going to turn out so well for King Louis. But the United States of America was now officially a new country.